the future that I think this field is betting on, and a future where we'll be able to unpack some of the really difficult why questions that the law asks every day in courtrooms across the country, really across the world. Why did you do that?
You are listening to TEDMED Conversations, where we share stories in health and medicine to inspire change for a healthier world. I'm your host, Kelly Thomas. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Francis Shen, professor of law and faculty member in the graduate program in neuroscience at the University of Minnesota and chief innovation officer at the MGH Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior. We explore the emerging interdisciplinary field of neurolaw and how advances in neuroscience and neurotechnology can be responsibly integrated into the legal system to improve decision-making and outcomes. We also talk about Francis's journey as a master's hurdler and how competing as an adult athlete has introduced him to an inspirational community. Francis, thank you for sitting down with TEDMED today. I'm excited for this conversation.
Thanks for having me. Excited to talk.
So you are director also of the Shen Neurolaw Lab at University of Minnesota, where you have a very interesting lab motto: every story is a brain story. I'm curious how you came up with that and also how it applies to the cross-disciplinary mission of the lab.
Great question. I don't know exactly the moment when I thought of the phrase, and maybe someone had thought of it before, though I haven't seen it before, and I hadn't seen it before. The origin story is that I'm grounded in the law. So I'm a law professor and was working around issues related to legal responses to trauma, especially survivors of rape and sexual assault and returning combat veterans. This was in the mid 2000s, early 2000s, when we were fighting wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what I was observing was that the law was really poor at understanding and explaining experiences that couldn't be seen or felt physically. And that's the experience of many of who experience different types of trauma. And that led me to look at the psychology of trauma and then eventually the neuroscience of trauma, and led to my aha moment, which was, wow, all these things I care about in law and policy, better criminal justice system, better education system. It's really about the way that our brains engage with the rest of our body and engage with the world, are processing information, and the way that that information processing gets changed, adjusted, improved by our colleagues, by our interactions, by the things we put in our body and so forth. And then I kind of just took a step back and said, wow, it's not just those who've experienced trauma. It's not just those in the legal system. It's all of us, and that our stories are really intimately tied to and in many ways created by our brains. And that's the origin of every story is a brain story. And then that connects with everything I do because I see the law and I see policymaking through this brain lens.
Neurolaw is an emerging field, which you are pioneering with some others. What are you most excited about and how neurolaw is being used today?
What I'm most excited about is advances in neurotechnology. The reason that we've become to understand the brain is so important is because of the technologies that allow us to look at the brain while we're still alive. So we don't have to wait until someone dies and crack open the skull and do an autopsy. We can see in different ways brain function and brain structure while we're still functioning. And those advances in technology have led to the place where we're in now, both kind of medically and legally. But it's the future that I think this field is betting on, and a future where we'll be able to unpack some of the really difficult why questions that the law asks every day in courtrooms across the country, really across the world. Why did you do that? Why are you continuing to do that, even though we're telling you not to? Why can't you get your act together? Those are mysterious questions, but they'll become less mysterious and we'll get more precise answers as these technologies allow us to figure out, okay, here's why when you're confronted with a situation like this, you're making some of these decisions. And then that's going to lead to better interventions, both in the legal system and just in our sort of social systems, to say, okay, here are some conditions in which it's going to be more likely for you to make choices that are going to make you better off and make all of us around you better off too.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us an example of a case where you found some new neural technology was really important in changing the way the judge viewed the case or the outcome?
Yeah, so there's a kind of a conceptual case, and it happened in Michigan a number of years ago now. And the basic gist of the case was that it's called Allen v. Bloomfield Hills, and there's a guy named Charles Allen who's a lifelong Amtrak conductor, great guy, family man. And one day, inexplicably, as he's coming along, he comes up to crossing guard gates, and this school bus swerves around the gates and tries to get in front of the bus and skate by. And the train hits the bus. Thankfully, there are no kids on the bus, but the bus driver is seriously hurt. And Mr. Allen is really traumatized by this experience. As he says later, your worst nightmare as a train conductor is to hit a car and especially to hit a school bus. So he can't go back to work and he brings a lawsuit, basically says, you need to compensate me, sues the school district that owned the bus and kind of regulated the driver. And the reason the case is so powerful is that Mr. Allen really didn't have scratches on his body. Remember, he's the conductor in this big train. So it's really clear that he had the traumatic experience and gets PTSD. It's pretty clear why, because he had this crazy, horrible experience. But it's also clear, and this was kind of my entry into the whole field, that he can walk fine. He can sit down. And if you and I looked at him, he'd look okay. But there was something inside him, and particularly something inside his brain that wasn't okay. So the district court, which is the first thing where you go, the trial court says, you can't really recover here because there's a statute that says you have to have bodily injury to recover. And your PTSD is not bodily injury. But he gets brain scans and he goes to the appellate court and they see the logic of the argument, which is very powerful logic, and says that PTSD and other types of mental disorders, they're facilitated by these interactions between physical brain cells. It's part of the body. The brain is part of the body. The appellate court says as much and finds in his favor. It sort of opens up this new window to all sorts of different legal possibilities. Everyone in Michigan gets really excited or concerned if you're an insurance provider, I guess, and goes up to Michigan Supreme Court. The night before they're about to go to trial, they settle. So we don't get sort of what's called binding case law, but it's a case that I love to teach. It's a case that sort of opens us up and raises these questions about how does the law conceptualize physical and mental injury? And I think that the law right now does a really poor job of responding to mental health, mental injuries. And I think the main reason is that we can't see it. So too often we sort of just dismiss it as you're just having a bad day. We wouldn't say that if you took a x-ray of somebody's femur and it was broken. You wouldn't say, maybe get a little sleep and you'll be better tomorrow, because we can see it. And hopefully in the future, we'll be able to see more and understand more of what's going on in mental life and then have a better response from law and from policy.
Mhm. Are those some of the studies that you're doing in your neurolaw lab, looking at MRIs or different types of scans and different brain states and how the brain might look different to the control group?
It's a great question. So we have done some collaborations with imagers. A lot of what we're doing right now is trying to apply the sort of work you're describing being done by others into the legal system amidst a lot of uncertainty. So it'd be great if some lab, actually, I'm talking to you now from something called the Masonic Institute for the Developing Brain at University of Minnesota, where I'll be working with colleagues here later today. And as I'll tell them, they do lots of brain scans of kids and young adults and emerging adults. If that brain scan sort of told us exactly what the law should do, but it doesn't, it gives us a little bit more information. And then the job of our lab at this intersection is to work with judges and courts and probation and parole officers and others in the legal system to first help understand what this brain science is and what it isn't, because it can be easily misused or it can be overclaimed. And then to think about, all right, how do you handle the uncertainty that comes with the behavioral assessment, the neurobiological assessment? So that's really where a lot of our focus is right now. We've been doing some really cool programs with judges, like spending a year with them and overnight retreats. The judges are hungry for this information in a lot of different ways, issues around cannabis that they're seeing in their courtroom or aging and dementia issues. And it's a similar theme, different set of science, different type of application, different legal doctrine, but the same core challenge of the law has to make a decision today. We don't have the luxury of saying check back in 10 years when the research has developed. So on one hand, we've got to make a decision, but what can we glean from the science as imperfect and as haltingly not yet done as it is today? And that's probably the central challenge that we're tackling right now.
That makes complete sense to me because as we age, our bodies are physically aging. So, of course, our brain is aging with us and changing. What are we learning about the aging brain that you can apply to the law and these different types of cases, adolescents or someone who might be suffering from dementia or someone who is suffering from PTSD? Do you foresee that being incorporated into the law and the policy?
Yeah, I do. And it's already happened. So at the group level, where the science is stronger, we know some things really well. We've known for decades, maybe centuries, maybe forever, that there's something which we now call the age crime curve. And roughly that means that 5 years don't commit crimes and 85-year-olds don't commit crimes. And what happens is the curve kind of goes up, starting around 13, 14, 15, not too many, but then 16 to 22, 24, 25, that is the zone where there's the highest likelihood of committing a crime. And then it tails off. Well, it turns out that that correlates with now what a lot of neuroscientists have discovered about brain maturity. There are different systems and different circuits in the brain, and they each mature at a different rate. By the time kids are 8, there are some things that they're already able to do as well as adults, but there are many things that will change. And in fact, sort of doing things well is probably not the right way to state it because there's some real evolutionary advantages to being a risk taker. This is why people look back and they'll drive past a college campus and say, "Oh, to be young again," because they see people doing what are crazy things. It's a really good feature, actually, but that can get us into some real trouble as well because we discount future risk. Our risk aversion is less. And that's been taken into account by the U.S. Supreme Court in changing our understanding of what is cruel and unusual under the Eighth Amendment. And so, based in part on neuroscience, the Supreme Court has ruled over the last 20 years that we cannot have the death penalty for those under 18. We can't have life without the possibility of parole automatically, even for homicide offenders under 18, and a series of other protections. And they cite the neuroscience all the way up to the Supreme Court. So it's having a real impact. And in fact, the kind of cutting edge of that scholarship is, and litigation as well, why just stop it at 18? Because really the neuroscience suggests maybe it's early to mid 20s. And Massachusetts has already moved forward and raised their age. So we're seeing a lot of effort there. With respect to aging even later in life, there's tremendous need for more research around degenerative diseases, the different types of dementia, including but not limited to Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia, Parkinson's, a number of others. I think it's fair to say that that research community wishes they could have made more progress. Alzheimer's disease, to take one example, remains a disease where at present we're getting better and better at detecting the early warning signs and being able to tell someone in their mid 40s and their 50s something about likelihood of onset based on genetics and on neurobiology and other measures. But problematically, we don't have a cure. And so this leads to conundrums about whether it's insurance coverage or it's whether to take an experimental drug, what to do. We are, though, really aware of some things that don't work for everyone, but work for most people. And that's this intimate relationship between environment and the things we put in our body and our brains. And I'm going to go back to what I said before, that one of the reasons that all of this brain stuff and brain storage is so challenging is we never see the brain changing. We see the rest of our body parts change. So someone in the weight room lifts a bunch of weights and they can see their bicep getting bigger. And in fact, that's how they measure progress. No one has ever said to me, "Boy, your brain is looking great," because we can't see the brain yet. But what we're able to learn from research is that the things we put in our body, so that would be diet, but also chemicals, environmental pollutants and the like, or good stuff, affects things. Sleep has a tremendous effect on the way that our brains develop. And again, we don't see it. We're not even conscious, right? We're just lying there unconscious. And yet there are scientists who are sort of figuring out, boy, there are all these cool things that are happening. Exercise is a major way in which brains can age in a more healthy way. But again, you almost have to take someone's word for it because you can't see it yourself. And that's, again, why I think the future is going to be one where we actually are able to see brain progress, and that will really bring people around. And last thing I'll say is that the visualization part of neuroscience has been really important in the law the ability to put a brain scan in front of jury members and have them change. And I think it will be clinically as well. And the doctor can tell you this, this, and this. But when the doctor shows you at some point a picture of your brain and says, Francis, here's what your brain looked like a year ago, then you change your diet and exercise, here's what it looks like now. That's not the way clinical medicine works right now. I see a future in which that is. And once that starts to happen, I think people will come around because it's so visceral. And without it, it just remains too mysterious. But yeah, diet, exercise, and friendship, those are really, really good things. And there's a whole neuroscience of loneliness kind of line of research as well, which is very powerful.
Hmm. Do you think that infusing neuroscience into the law will be able to keep up with all the things that we're learning about the brain? How does the law keep up with the emerging data and in a safe and practical way?
Well, that's a really tough question, and it's a good one. There's this book that I'm trying to finish up, and I use this quote from a really important legal scholar named Roscoe Pound, who's been deceased now, former dean of Harvard Law School. And this quote is really simple, but it's really profound. It says, "The law must remain stable, and yet it cannot remain the same." And the law is inherently conservative, and not in like a political sense, but in just a we don't like to change too much. So law will always lag, I think, technological development. We're seeing it right now in AI, right? The law is rapid and social media and all these things trying to catch up quickly. It does eventually catch up. I think with neuroscience, it would be really good, and that's what a lot of our work is, if we're prepared for that future so that it doesn't catch us unawares. But the trick is that you don't want to prepare for a future that never comes, right? Like a false earthquake is like, we're ready for, we're all prepared. Yeah, right. The earthquake didn't happen, the end of the world didn't come. So we try to be really realistic and think about, all right, what is actually likely to happen in the next, 5, 10 years, and then beyond that, 10 to 25 years. So I do think the law will keep up. I think we're going to need new voices in the law. So we are really excited. We've got a new Dana Foundation funded training program. It's called the Neurotech Justice Accelerator at Mass General. So it's a Boston-based program. It's awesome with colleagues. And we're trying to train the next generation of leaders in these fields, leaders who will be around much longer than I will be, and sort of guide the law and policy and be the sort of leaders in the field of neurolaw.
Mhm. I have a few follow-up questions to that, but we'll start with AI. We're just seeing all the time in the news, AI in healthcare, AI in medicine, AI in everything, and how we're going to manage it. How are the current advances in AI being applied right now in neurolaw?
So AI is really important for neuroscience and law for a couple reasons. One is that a lot of the motivation, the inspiration for the systems that are being developed is the human brain. It's not reverse engineering the brain because that's difficult, but it's thinking through ways in which you can artificially do the things that the brain does. That's ultimately the goal. So all of this work, say, around ChatGPT or the new Siri, and what we're trying to do is create a non-human information processing system that feels and produces, and maybe even looks eventually, a lot like the information processing systems that we call humans, like we call our friends. So that's one big thing, is that neuroscience is the target of a lot of AI. The second is that neuroscience is being used and has been used for a long time now in different ways in machine learning to process and understand lots and lots of neural data. So the ability to collect a bunch of data from the brain, more and more and more and more, I mean, orders of magnitude more, doesn't do you a lot of good if it's just a human there trying to like sort through all the data. It's just too much. And so you need the AI to make sense of it. And then a third way is that AI is being used directly to address the neurodegenerative disorders, to address mental health disorders, to try and create interventions to improve behavior and mental outcomes. A Google search will result in hundreds of companies that are trying different ways to approach this. I'm involved in some ethics and law work with some of those. And again, there's a lot of potential promise there, really challenging, but some promise because we have a real gap in mental health care. We have really long wait line for people who want consults and counseling. And one of the ideas is that AI could play a role in improving brain health by augmenting, maybe replacing, but certainly just at a minimum, augmenting the types of care modalities that are already in place. So I think those are three ways that it's already happening. And neuroscience technologies, neurotech, most probably are utilizing in one way or another advances in AI. So that's really synergistic, and it'll be really interesting to see how it all develops. But AI came up pretty quickly. So I was teaching law and AI back in 2016. I remember talking with the students. It was the first course in our building on it. So do you think anyone else in this building has any idea what's like no, no, right? Because it wasn't a thing yet. And then it suddenly, over the course of 5, 7 years, became a huge thing. And neuroscience has not had that moment yet, but it will. I have no doubt that it will.
As this progress continues, are you seeing already different policies and laws be put into place that can help assure that the advances in AI will be used properly?
Yeah, there's a lot of conversation around data privacy, brain privacy, sometimes called neuro-rights, but I think broadly it's a question about making sure that individuals have control and power as much as it's possible over where their data goes and who it's shared with and how it's used. And so state legislatures and national governments, both in the US and the EU and beyond, are coming at this from a lot of different angles and with a lot of different considerations. But it's a really hot topic. I think it will continue to be. And I think the neural data part of that, as well as what I say is sort of data that allows you to infer a brain state. So smartphone data, if someone's sitting there and all their queries to the search engine are about self-harm, that's a really important indicator. And actually, that's a good example where there's this balance between, on one hand, you want someone's data to be their own. On the other hand, if there are enough warning signs, both for protecting them or for protecting others, an intervention, or at least a potential intervention, seems like it might be on the table. And that's a here and now question. Those things are happening today. So that digital phenotyping space, digital psychiatry, the integration of objective measures into psychiatry, that's all happening in real time right now. Most aren't aware of it, but that's the front lines. And so the legal protections need to be there. Are they there yet? No, I don't think so. I think there are a lot of gaps, but and I also think there's this balance between not wanting to overregulate and getting that balance right. So it's an ongoing conversation.
It seems very cross-disciplinary and parties coming from so many different places. Is that what the makeup of your neuro law lab looks like as well? What types of students and trainees are there?
That is exactly what our lab looked like. So our trainees over the last 2 years, they've come from, on the medical side, psychiatry, neurology, radiology. On the law side, all types of law students, criminal law, health law, FDA law. The undergrads come from a variety of backgrounds. It might be neuroscience background, political science, government, economics, computer science. So our range is really broad. And I think everyone in the lab finds some way to utilize and leverage their talents and learn from everyone else. And what I care about is the law, is better courtroom decisions, improve courtroom decisions, and improve policy in legislatures. And that requires not just synthesis, but some hard choices. And so I'm excited that a lot of our future projects are very heavily thinking about very practical questions. They're influenced, they're grounded in, they're aware of the more complex discussions that are necessary. But it's like, okay, you're going to sentence for 1 year or 2 years or 5 years. And what is the person going to do while they're sentenced? That's what it boils down to. And hopefully, those types of decisions will be improved eventually through our work.
Have you found that judges and other lawyers are open to this possibility of incorporating neuroscience into the law to help make those choices?
Yes, if it's concrete, and no if it's abstract. So the judges that I've worked with across the, political spectrum too, one of the things I say at the beginning is this is neuroscience and law isn't like a get out of jail free card on the criminal side, or on the civil side. It's not just for the plaintiff's attorney. Insurance can benefit from this stuff too. So it has to be, I think, neutral. We've really focused a lot on that to try and make sure that this science doesn't get politicized. And I think right now we've done a pretty good job of that. My hope is that brain science continues to be a lot like cancer research, because everyone's had a loved one who's experienced cancer, and everyone's had a loved one who's had a mental challenge. or a brain health challenge. That's one way to keep the judges and the lawyers engaged. And the second thing is be really concrete and realistic. Something that our colleagues do when we do our judges training is make sure that, as my colleague, Dr. Judith Edersheim says, we're not going to show you the Ferrari because you don't have the Ferrari to pull out of your garage. You've got very limited resources. Let's give you the actual type of model, the type of recommendations that you could implement in a heavily resource constrained environment. And that's tough. So we really think about that realistic, concrete work. And something that we emphasize a lot is that it's hard to predict human behavior. A good example would be the NFL draft, where millions and millions and millions of dollars are spent on these really smart people, and they're trying to predict who's going to be the next good quarterback. And they fail all the time. But one of the things that they're careful about is that because they know it's hard to predict, they offer contracts or they get out of them after a while. And we don't do that too much in law, unfortunately. We sort of give a sentence for 2 years or 5 years or 20 years, and we might check back in with you really close to when you're let out for early release. But what we ought to be doing is evaluating performance, brain performance, how are you processing information regularly to see if there's any progress. And for some, there might not be, and you'd have to stay incarcerated or find something else. And for some, there might be, in which case, okay, turns out you don't need to be here 15 years because we've been checking annually and there's actual progress. So that's just a totally different way of thinking about the legal system, but it's a way that's very attuned with the neuroscience of neuroplasticity and just what we know about how brains change, especially, as I was saying, in those early critical periods. Your 28 was already different than 22. 35 is definitely different than 22. So maybe in the law, we might take that into account and create a system where we'd actually check in annually and have some data. I hope we get to that point. I haven't seen a system that sort of fully embraced that. I think there are parts of it that get picked up, but I think something like that would resonate, certainly in the interest of public safety. It's still in the interest of holding someone accountable. So like I said, it's not a get out of jail free card, but it's an individualized process. Whether it's in the criminal law or in medicine, the individualization piece is really critical.
Absolutely. And, that sounds like it would also inspire and give people hope. Okay, I'm incarcerated, but if there are check ins and I am trying to do the right thing, then maybe my outcome is different. Thinking back to what you said also about what we put into our bodies and how that changes our health span over time, if we were checking in to look at how not just our physical selves are affected by what we're eating, but our brain also, then that might change the way people pay attention to how they are treating their body.
I would hope so. I think you're absolutely right. I think that it's just so easy because you just don't see the effects at all until it's too late. And there is a lot of individual variation as well, and that makes it difficult because it's not the case that everyone who does X is going to end up with outcome Y. We've all probably have a relative, who smoked their whole life but never got cancer. Okay, but that but what? And yet that's what we've got. We've got these individualized needs, but we've got sort of generalized medicine. And the push is towards precision and individualized medicine in a lot of areas. My brother's an oncologist who talk about this all the time, and his whole world is instead of just placing all of these 10 people who present with similar symptoms in the same box, is to take their genetic information, really careful histories, look at down at the cellular level and say, you know what? Actually, you might benefit from this combination of chemo and this, and you might benefit from these things. That individualized approach in medicine is a smart way to go. And I think the individualized approach in law is a smart way to go. But in order to do that, you've got to see on the medicine side, like, is it working? Let's try this for 6 months. Let's see if it's working. And in psychiatry, the way that we see it's working right now is it's just self-report, which is a really good place to start. I'm not saying we eliminate it, but we're going to rapidly be in a future. I'll give you a very concrete example. Somebody walks into the office. They probably couldn't get the appointment. So it's been 6 weeks, let's say, since they last saw. How you been sleeping? So that's taking 6 weeks of sleep data. And I'm sure that the person's probably going to say, oh yeah, pretty good. I've been sleep. We're going to be in a future where instead of that imprecise answer, it can start with, okay, I'm looking at your individualized sleep data from your sleep tracking, and here's how it's been the last 6 weeks. Like that, starting with that objective data. And that's going to transform, I think, care. Like, oh yeah, boy, I haven't been sleeping well, or I thought I was and I wasn't, or actually I'm doing pretty well. Those indicators. And then the last thing I'll say is that you're so right about incentives. So where this digital psychiatry is going. The app makers already know this. That's why any app where they're like addiction, for the kids, it's like they always get that next reward. Oh, I want to get 3 more points. I want to get 2 more. And so now it's like, what are those little cake points? But those sorts of things really matter. And because they can see it, right? It's visceral. You can see the pile going up. You can see the number going up in the corner. As we get more stuff like that, first it's going to be behavioral, like number of steps, say that's been a thing for a while. But once it becomes brain data, I'm really sure people are going to respond. Certainly those who want to, but probably some that don't. It's like, wow, okay, I'm seeing my brain change. And I think that's going to have a big effect.
Speaking of rewards and responses in training, you are a very fast hurdler. I watched the video of you hurdling. You're a master's hurdler, and you've been doing this for a very long time, since you were a kid. And I think it's amazing. I'm a competitive tennis player. I was as a kid, and I get to do that as an adult, and I love it. What is it about hurdling that brings you back time and time again? And how do you think that is affecting your brain health?
Well, with the caveat, as I was just saying, I can't actually see how it's affecting my brain health. I think it's had a major and positive impact. This will be my 33rd consecutive year of competitive hurdling. I run over now 39-inch barriers and 36-inch barriers. So there are two races. One is straight down a straightaway called the 110-meter hurdles, and the other like once around an outdoor track, 400-meter hurdles. The hurdles for me are a place to get away from everything else, a very busy life with family and work and everything. So it's a very spiritual experience. I think what's important for me is that it's very competitive, and it's a way that, because I'm a competitive person, it fuels that. It's a daily confrontation of fears, because you never know, especially as you get older, if this is going to be the day when you can sort of no longer do it or no longer do it in the right way. And so, I'll run hurdle workouts and track workouts. And what happens is that you train your brain to conquer these challenges, and you do it again and again and again. So that's, tens of thousands of hours of doing it. And it begins to pay off in other areas as well. So the same sorts of emotional feelings or ability to overcome challenges and obstacles that I've experienced on the track translates really well into other sorts of moments of life. Still to this day, what's really fascinating to me is that although my body's very different than it was at age 16, mentally, when I get into the starting blocks and sort of right on your mark, set, go, like the nerves and I've done that so many times, but it's still the same experience mentally. In fact, one of the challenges, I'm sure you experience the same as well, is that for anyone who's still competing, your brain wants to do things that your body probably can't do. So you have to modify it a little bit. The other thing I'll say is that there are fewer and fewer opportunities. I think it's a problem as we age to have what were very normal activities in high school, and then for those competed in college. And same thing I say in the arts, students who found their amazing fulfillment in theater, and then it falls out. And exercising those circuits of our brain to me is really important. And again, it's because we can't see it, we can't see the atrophy, right? Like which we would if we, stopped using some other part of our body for a long time. So yeah, it's eye-opening, it's really engaging, it's a great community. I'd encourage anyone to pursue their passions later in life, whether they're athletic or artistic or elsewhere. I think it's been a major, major boon for my mental health. And it's hard to describe, but a big component of it.
No, I agree. It's incredibly inspiring. I feel the same way. The community, not just the competition and the preparation and the other things that you have to do to compete to maintain your physical fitness, but the community of people, mostly women, because it's a women's league that I compete in, has really just lifted me up too. People I would never have met.
Speaking of community, one of the emerging areas of neuroscience that I think is really important is the neuroscience of loneliness, or maybe the positive spin is sort of the neuroscience of social connection. It turns out that scientists are finding how loneliness reshapes the brain in ways that are not good. And the flip side of that is that strong social connections, friendships, familiar relationships really strengthen circuits in the brain that promote mental health, that promote resilience. It's sometimes been called the silent killer, loneliness, because again, you can't see it. Somebody can tell you I'm lonely. You can see if someone's lonely. We've all felt loneliness and it kind of feels crummy, But it also, I think, tends to feel like something that we should just get over. Like it's a very individualized thing. I'm just going to wake up tomorrow and stop being lonely. But it's a neurobiological process, just as the way, or a neurobiological state, just as these other things are. I think recognizing that, and again, there's a big behavioral literature on the value of connectedness, social connectedness, both sort of individually and then, in larger groups. That's a really important thing to keep in mind, both for the law and thinking about how we might improve outcomes for those who are justice involved, and for policymaking, and frankly, just for the way that we navigate our lives. Maybe just remember the next time somebody is experiencing loneliness, you can think about that as a brain issue because it is, and the evidence is really clear that it is. And that also means that positive interventions can improve brain health in that context too.
What has been the most exciting moment you've had or the most surprising thing that has happened as an adult athlete?
Competing in world international competitions has been the coolest thing. I had known about them. I hadn't really thought much about them before. And so I finally tried one. The way this works is we've got a world federation, the World Masters Athletics Games. And I didn't know what to expect when I went. But what I discovered were a couple things. There aren't many people my age who are still hurdling, but when you aggregate across the whole world, you find other people. And although we didn't even speak the same language, kind of our verbal language, we did speak the same kind of track language. And so it was really amazing to find kindred spirits from Japan and South America and China and all over Ukraine as well. I mean, it was amazing. And it was really uplifting. It was sort of this Olympic ideal of here we were, of course, trying to beat each other on one hand, but as you suggest, also afterwards, getting our photos together and just sort of camaraderie of. So that was really awesome. It was cool to represent the country. And I had this great moment where there's a USA teammate who's in the 85 age group division. And I got to know her a little bit. And what I loved about it was that when I first saw her, because she was in her USA uniform and walking around the track, my first question to her as we introduced ourselves was, "What is your event?" And what I liked about that is in the rest of her life, she's a grandmother. And probably if I saw her in the grocery store, I think, oh, there's a nice older lady. But she's an athlete first at our meets. Where else in her life or in our lives are you an athlete first? It's just really cool because she is an athlete first on that day. And it embraced and really empowered everyone to wherever they are in their skill level and their athletic journey to do that. So that was the coolest thing. I've had some other really fun moments and great performances, but that kind of kept me going. I was like, this is the coolest thing ever. I've got instant friends across the world, and we all are crazy enough to keep doing this. And it talks a lot about the human spirit. I guess the last thing I say is about relative to the brain. It's a myth that a lot of other people couldn't keep doing this as well. And so I think there's a lot of myth busting that happens. The body is still able to do absolutely incredible things. These 70 and 80-year-old people, 85 plus, whatever, doing things. I'm like, that is wild. I just had a teammate who's going to turn 75 this year, and he's running times that would, beat a lot of high school kids. It's really inspiring. And we have these myths that you do certain things at certain ages. Those are brain myths in some ways. Yes, your physical body is a little bit different. I'm not suggesting that it's not, that the body doesn't age, but it doesn't age in ways that maybe we pretend it does sometimes.
Yeah, that's incredible. The resiliency that your body can have if your brain can tell it it's okay. Keep going.
Yeah, for sure. And that's in daily life too. We see it in my students all the time. Law school is challenging, but we're not making them carry 40-pound sacks. Or the reason it's challenging is because it's challenging on the brain and processing information. And we sometimes have these mental health awareness weeks or days where it's just about, all right, how can you navigate all of this in a way that still leaves you really excited to wake up every day and get after it? And those are clearly brain questions, but they're influenced, and this is why I like the line of questioning, by like everything else you're doing, whatever your thing is, whether it's doing working out or it's being in the arts or it's being social or reading club or something. We don't, again, I think we sort of dismiss that stuff too much sometimes because it doesn't feel like, oh, it's just, why are you just doing that? Well, if you could see how your brain was changing and how it's getting stronger and those circuits are improving, that those are the same circuits you're going to need when you go in a courtroom or you do a law school exam or do a business transaction, whatever it is. And so I'm going to keep promoting all that stuff for sure, even though we can't see it. And even though in some ways you got to take it on faith, but there's a lot of good behavioral evidence that exercise in particular is really, really good for the brain on average.
That would actually be a really interesting grant. I don't know if the NIH has one, but doing brain scans on people who have specific training programs or are eating certain types of diets and seeing how their brain looks before, after, maybe during an exam, or if they're in the courtroom, something when they're in a more stressful environment, did the preparation and the other things they're doing change the way that their brain's reacting?
Yeah, it'd be really cool. And eventually, as our technology improves and we can do real-time measurements of brain, we'll start to see some of that stuff. We're far away from it, but the behavioral evidence, Kelly, is so clear that sleep, diet, nutrition, and healthy social connections will take anyone a really long, long way. And in some ways, you don't need neuroscience for that, but in other ways, you do, because clearly folks we're not all attaching, including like myself. Sleep is actually an example where for the longest time, because I can do pretty well in low sleep, I thought, I'm not someone who needs much sleep. And I really started to read a lot of the neuroscience of sleep. And I'm like, okay, actually, this is not that good. So as my wife knows, I've really tried to up that sleep. I felt fine, but I couldn't see what's going on inside the skull. And I'm convinced by the neuroscience of sleep literature that I ought to be sleeping more. So I've changed that.
What is your biggest hope for the future of neurolaw?
My biggest hope is that this becomes a way of thinking that is not politicized and just becomes a really natural part of the way that we navigate society, including the law, but not limited to the law, so that more and more people think, yeah, every story is a brain story, that the brain is not just important in the sense of protect your brain, but is critically important, and to recognize that all of our mental functioning, all of our moods, all of our greatest, desires and hopes are somehow, as mysterious as it may be, somehow connected to the way that our brains function. Because if we can get to that point, then everything else naturally follows. Because, of course, the law then should be really concerned about brain health. Of course, our intervention should be individualized and really sort of paying attention to how our brains change. So to me, that's the big thing. It's the conceptual piece. And once that conceptual idea sticks, we'll look back at this conversation in 50 years and people say, "What? That's ridiculous. Of course, we already know all that. Let me click onto something I don't know." Right now, that's not the case. Right now, I'm out there in the wilderness and reaching the neurolaw gospel. And I think once it gets picked up, I hope that it's one of those things where you say, and others say, of course, why didn't we always think like this? That would be really cool.
I wish you the biggest success, and I hope that by sharing your story here at TEDMED, we can help spread the word.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. And thanks to TEDMED for all the great work that you do. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Francis, for your time and inspiration.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to TEDMED Conversations. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe on Spotify and our YouTube channel.